Judge smirks at black lawyer, stunned, when he turns the case upside down. The courtroom was already against him before he even spoke. Jonathan Cole adjusted his tie, standing at the defendant's table. His charcoal suit wasn't the newest, and his shoes had seen better days, but his posture was unwavering. Across from him sat Bradley Sterling, a high-powered corporate attorney with a flawless navy blue suit and the smug confidence of a man who had never lost to someone like Jonathan. At the bench, Judge Walter Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. He tapped his gavel lightly, as if this was more of a formality than a real case. "Mr. Cole," the judge drawled, peering over his glasses, "representing yourself today?" Jonathan met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." The smirk deepened. "Interesting choice." A chuckle echoed from the opposing table. Sterling shook his head slightly, just enough for Jonathan to notice. His assistant, a younger paralegal with slicked-back hair, hid a smirk behind his notepad. Jonathan knew exactly what was happening. They were underestimating him. They thought this would be quick, another easy win for Sterling and his clients. They had no idea what was coming. Judge Grayson sighed and flipped through the case file. "This is a foreclosure dispute, correct? You're claiming the bank unlawfully seized your mother's home." "Yes, sir," Jonathan replied evenly. The judge barely glanced at him. "And you think you can argue against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Sterling?" Jonathan's response was immediate. "I don't think, Your Honor. I know." The quiet murmurs in the courtroom stopped. A few attorneys in the gallery leaned forward. Even Sterling, who had been half distracted adjusting his cufflinks, looked up. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "All right then, Mr. Cole, let's get on with it." Sterling stood first, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate ease. He moved with practiced confidence, the kind that came from crushing small-time cases for years. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the courtroom, "this case is simple." He gestured toward Jonathan with barely concealed condescension. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was legally foreclosed. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotion. It is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Mr. Cole's mother did not." He turned to the judge with a well-timed nod. "I sympathize. Losing a home is painful, but pain does not override legal responsibility." He sat back down, folding his hands, as if the case was already over. Jonathan sat still, unmoved. He had expected this. He had counted on it. Taking a steady breath, he rose from his seat. He didn't move to the center of the courtroom. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded attention. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and controlled. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear. The question is, did his client actually follow it?" Sterling's smirk twitched, just for a second. Jonathan continued, his eyes never leaving the judge. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, and every loophole that banks and corporations use to strip homes away from families." He took a measured step forward. "And I found something." Judge Grayson leaned slightly forward. "Something?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes. And it changes everything." A nervous whisper spread through the gallery. Sterling shifted slightly in his seat, but Jonathan saw the flicker of irritation on his face. Sterling chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, this should be good." Jonathan ignored him and turned back to the judge. "Before I proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official motion for discovery. I have reason to believe that the plaintiff is hiding key documents that will prove fraud." Silence. The word fraud hit the air like a brick. Judge Grayson sat up, his smirk fading into mild curiosity. "Fraud, Mr. Cole?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The foreclosure on my mother's home was based on falsified documents, and I can prove it. Sterling let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in mock exasperation. Your Honor, this is absurd. This is a baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. Jonathan turned toward him, his voice even. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage agreement contains two different signatures from the same person? A ripple of whispers spread across the courtroom. Sterling's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? Jonathan reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out 2 copies of the mortgage agreement. He walked them to the bailiff. These are 2 separate copies of the same document, Your Honor. One from the initial filing and one from a modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice they don't match. The judge scanned the papers. His forehead creased. Jonathan continued. Now, I'm no expert, but I know my mother's signature, and that second one, that's not hers. The judge flipped through the pages again, his expression shifting from mild interest to focused intensity. He looked up at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, he said, his tone suddenly sharper, do you have an explanation for this? Sterling cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time. Jonathan didn't let up. Maybe, but that second signature was filed 3 months after the original, and if you compare them side by side, he pointed to the judge's papers, you'll see that not only are they different, but the second one was signed the day after my mother was hospitalized for a stroke. A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, flipping through the documents again. Jonathan stepped closer. Your Honor, I request that the plaintiff provide the original signed documents, because if they can't, then this entire foreclosure was based on a forged contract. Sterling's posture stiffened. His assistant whispered something urgent into his ear. The judge's tone was dangerously calm. Mr. Sterling, does your client have the original signed mortgage documents on file? Sterling hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable. But Jonathan saw it, and so did the judge. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. Jonathan smiled. That's fine. I'll wait. The entire room went silent. The judge slowly set down the documents, his expression now completely serious. This case, he said, is no longer as simple as it seemed. Jonathan exhaled deeply. They had mocked him. They had underestimated him. But now, they weren't laughing anymore, and this was only the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut. Jonathan stood firm, his expression unreadable as he watched Judge Grayson flip through the mortgage documents, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. Across the room, Bradley Sterling sat unnervingly still, his fingers clasped together in what appeared to be forced composure. But Jonathan knew better. Sterling was rattled. Mr. Sterling, the judge finally said, adjusting his glasses, these signatures do not match, and considering that one of them was allegedly signed while the homeowner was in the hospital, I'm inclined to question the validity of the foreclosure. Sterling exhaled, shaking his head. Your Honor, we are happy to provide additional documentation to confirm the legitimacy of the process. However, this is a mere technicality, not evidence of fraud. Jonathan didn't wait for permission to speak. A technicality? His voice was measured but sharp. Are we calling forgery a technicality now, Mr. Sterling? Sterling shot him a glare. Mr. Cole, I would advise you not to make baseless accusations. Baseless? Jonathan let out a humorless chuckle. Then you won't mind if we subpoena the bank's original records, right? Because surely, if everything was done legally, those files will be intact, and those signatures will be consistent. Judge Grayson nodded. I agree. The court orders full discovery. Mr. Sterling, Have your client provide the original mortgage documents within 48 hours? Sterling's jaw tensed. Understood. But Jonathan knew that hesitation meant something. Sterling had just lost control of the narrative. The judge shifted his gaze to Jonathan. Mr. Cole, I will allow your request, but I strongly advise you to stay within the boundaries of legal argumentation. Do not make accusations that you cannot substantiate. Jonathan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Grayson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Court is adjourned until further notice. He banged the gavel, and just like that, the room erupted in whispers. Jonathan remained in place, watching as Sterling whispered something to his assistant before gathering his papers too quickly, as if escaping was his priority. Jonathan turned, feeling a presence beside him. A tall woman with confident eyes and a sharp navy suit stood there, arms crossed. Not bad, she murmured. He blinked. Excuse me. The woman extended her hand. Samantha Hayes, legal consultant. Jonathan shook her hand cautiously. Legal consultant for whom? She smirked. Right now? You. Jonathan frowned. I don't recall hiring one. You didn't, Samantha admitted, tilting her head toward the other side of the courtroom. But Sterling did. And trust me, if he needs extra firepower, that means you're winning. Jonathan exhaled. So what? You're switching sides? She shrugged. I don't take sides. I follow facts. And I happen to know something that might interest you. He studied her. I'm listening. Samantha leaned in slightly. You're not just fighting a law firm, Mr. Cole. You're fighting a system that profits off cases like this. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. How deep does it go? She sighed. Deep enough that if you don't play this smart, they're going to bury you. Jonathan crossed his arms. Then let's make sure they don't. Samantha smirked. Now you're talking. Just then, Jonathan caught sight of Sterling watching them from across the room. The way his eyes narrowed confirmed something. He knew that Jonathan wasn't just another case anymore. Jonathan grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the exit, his mind already several steps ahead. He had exposed one crack in their case. Now he had 48 hours to bring the whole thing crashing down. Jonathan sat in his office, his eyes locked on the stack of files Samantha had handed him earlier that evening. The weight of what he was about to do pressed against his chest, but he knew there was no turning back now. If Samantha was right, if the system was rigged from the inside, then this wasn't just about his client's home anymore. It was about every person who had been steamrolled by corporations like Sterling's firm. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door creaked open, and Samantha stepped inside, her arms crossed over a slim file. I hope you got some rest, she said, shutting the door behind her. Jonathan scoffed. I don't think I even blinked. Samantha smirked. Good. Because you're going to want to be fully alert for this. She dropped the file onto his desk, the folder sliding open just enough for Jonathan to catch a glimpse of a confidential stamp. Jonathan frowned, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the top page, then the next, and with each word his pulse quickened. This, he exhaled, this is a list of fraudulent foreclosures. Samantha nodded. And guess which law firm is at the center of most of them? Jonathan clenched his jaw. Sterling's. Bingo. She slid into the chair across from him. Turns out they've been pulling this scam for years. The signatures, the missing transfer records. Your case isn't an outlier, Jonathan. It's the playbook. Jonathan closed the file, exhaling sharply. If I take this to the judge, they won't be able to dismiss it as a one-time clerical error. Samantha nodded. Exactly. But you're missing something important. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. What? Samantha leaned in. Who do you think is protecting them? The question sent a chill through him. Because she was right. A scam this big? There was no way Sterling's firm was operating alone. Someone above them was letting this happen. Jonathan rubbed his temples. If I push this, if I expose it, they will come for you, Samantha finished. They will discredit you, intimidate you, make your life hell. Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. Then we better make sure that when I hit them so hard they can't get back up. Samantha smirked. That's what I like to hear. Just then, Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Samantha frowned, expecting a call. Jonathan hesitated before answering. Jonathan Cole. A deep voice responded, low and calculated. You don't know me, Mr. Cole, but you should listen carefully. Jonathan tensed. Who is this? The man ignored the question. If you're smart, you'll walk away from this case. This isn't your fight. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Samantha, who was already pulling out her laptop, typing furiously. Jonathan tightened his grip on the phone. You think threatening me is going to work? It's not a threat, the voice said. It's a promise. Drop the case. Forget what you saw. Click. The line went dead. Jonathan set his phone down, exhaling slowly. Samantha looked up. Did they just threaten you? Jonathan smirked. Yeah. Samantha studied him for a second before shaking her head. You love this, don't you? Jonathan leaned back, cracking his knuckles. No, but I do love watching people panic. Because whoever that was, they were scared, which meant Jonathan was getting close. The courtroom was unusually quiet as Jonathan walked in, his expression unreadable. The weight of the previous night's warning still lingered in his mind, but if whoever had called him thought they could intimidate him into backing down, they had made a huge mistake. Sterling was already there, sitting at his table with his usual smug confidence, flipping through his notes like this was just another easy win. His arrogance was almost admirable, if it weren't so misplaced. Judge Henderson entered, his robe flowing behind him as he took his seat. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Jonathan. You seem particularly confident today, Mr. Cole, the judge noted dryly. Jonathan smiled. Just well prepared, Your Honor. Sterling scoffed under his breath but didn't say anything. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses. All right, let's proceed. Mr. Sterling, you may continue your arguments. Sterling rose, buttoning his jacket with deliberate ease. He turned toward the jury with the kind of confidence only a man who had never truly lost could have. Ladies and gentlemen, he began smoothly, we have indulged Mr. Cole long enough. He has wasted this court's time with baseless accusations, conspiracy theories, and meaningless distractions. But the facts remain clear. He gestured to the documents in front of him. My client acquired this property legally through foreclosure. The defendant failed to meet his financial obligations. And all of this, he waved his hand dismissively, is nothing more than an attempt to stall the inevitable. Jonathan remained seated, his expression unmoved. Sterling smirked slightly before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, the only course of action here is to dismiss these claims and allow my client to proceed with the rightful eviction. Judge Henderson nodded. Noted. He turned to Jonathan. Mr. Cole, do you have anything substantial to present, or should we move forward with Mr. Sterling's request? Jonathan slowly stood, buttoning his own jacket before stepping toward the center of the room. I do, Your Honor. In fact, I have something that will completely change the direction of this case. Sterling's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. Jonathan reached into his briefcase and pulled out 2 separate documents. These, he said, placing them on the table before the judge, are 2 versions of the same mortgage agreement. The judge frowned as he picked them up, flipping through the pages. Jonathan stepped closer. One was filed at the original loan signing. The other was conveniently modified months later, right before the bank initiated foreclosure. The courtroom stilled. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses, scanning both documents. "And what exactly am I looking for, Mr. Cole?" Jonathan turned toward the jury. "Compare the signatures, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the judge did just that. Sterling shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his pen. Jonathan's voice was steady, controlled. "As you can see, the signatures don't match." The judge's brow furrowed. "Are you saying this signature was forged, Mr. Cole?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor." A sharp murmur spread through the gallery. Sterling immediately shot up from his seat. "Objection! This is absurd. There is no proof." Jonathan cut him off. "Actually, there is." He turned back to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Sterling froze. Judge Henderson raised an eyebrow. "A witness? Who?" Jonathan stepped aside as the courtroom doors opened, and in walked Linda Myers. The courtroom exploded in whispers. Sterling's face drained of color. Linda, the notary public, who had allegedly signed off on the second mortgage agreement, walked toward the stand, looking visibly uncomfortable. She adjusted her glasses, her hands trembling slightly as she took a seat. Judge Henderson looked intrigued now. "Ms. Myers, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan stepped closer. "Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing this second mortgage modification?" Linda hesitated, glancing at Sterling, then back at Jonathan. I do," Jonathan nodded. "And were you present when my client signed this document?" Silence. Linda's hands twisted in her lap. She took a deep breath. I wasn't." A collective gasp filled the room. Sterling stood abruptly. "Objection! This is completely inappropriate." "Overruled," the judge said, eyes narrowing slightly. "Proceed, Mr. Cole." Jonathan turned back to Linda. "Then can you tell us how your notary stamp ended up on this document?" Linda's lips pressed together, her hands clenched in her lap. Finally, she whispered, "I was told to stamp it after the fact." Jonathan tilted his head. "By whom?" Linda swallowed hard. "By the bank's legal team." Sterling slammed his hands on the table. "Objection! This is—" The judge turned to him, his patience wearing thin. "Mr. Sterling, if you interrupt this testimony one more time, you'll be held in contempt." Sterling clenched his jaw but sat down. Jonathan faced Linda again. "Just to clarify, you are saying you did not witness this signature being made, but you notarized it anyway, under instruction." Linda gave a small nod. "Yes." Jonathan turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this means that the bank's claim to this property is based on a fraudulent document." Sterling's mouth tightened. Jonathan continued. "This isn't just about my client. This is about hundreds of cases just like this, where banks have forged signatures and manipulated documents to push through foreclosures." He turned to the jury. "If we allow this to go unchecked, then what's stopping them from doing it again and again?" A deep tension settled over the room. Judge Henderson flipped through the documents again, his face unreadable. Then he slowly placed them down. "This," he said, voice controlled, "is a serious allegation." Sterling jumped up. "Your Honor, Enough, Mr. Sterling." The judge's voice was sharp, final. Sterling froze. The judge turned back to Jonathan. "You've presented compelling evidence, Mr. Cole. I will take it under review before making my ruling." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge looked at Sterling, his gaze hard. "I suggest your client starts answering some questions." Sterling's face was a mask of fury. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jonathan took his seat, his pulse steady. Sterling was cornered. And this was just the beginning. The courtroom was thick with tension. The revelation of fraudulent notarization had sent a ripple through the room, shifting the balance of power. For the first time, Jonathan saw doubt creeping into Judge Henderson's previously dismissive expression. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Sterling had been quiet, his face a mask of barely concealed rage, but Jonathan could see it in his eyes. He was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Judge Henderson finally broke the silence. "Mr. Sterling, I assume you have an explanation for why a fraudulent signature appears on these mortgage documents." Sterling took a slow breath, smoothing down his tie. His voice was calm, but there was a slight edge to it. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a procedural oversight. Clerical errors happen. It does not change the fact that my client legally acquired this property." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle. "A clerical error? That's your defense?" Sterling turned sharply. "Yes, Mr. Cole, because unless you can prove intentional fraud, an error in documentation does not make the foreclosure unlawful." Jonathan tilted his head, studying him. "So you're saying this was an accident?" Sterling's lips pressed into a thin line. "That is exactly what I'm saying." Jonathan reached into his briefcase, pulling out another document. He turned to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this into evidence." The bailiff took the paper and handed it to the judge, who adjusted his glasses and skimmed the page. His brow furrowed. "What is this?" Henderson asked. Jonathan stepped forward. "It's a sworn affidavit from a former loan officer at the bank, one who personally witnessed employees altering foreclosure documents to ensure faster processing." The entire courtroom shifted. Sterling's face lost its color. Jonathan let the silence stretch before speaking again. "This is not just about one clerical error. This is a pattern of fraud." Judge Henderson exhaled sharply. "Mr. Sterling, do you have a response to this?" Sterling swallowed hard, flipping through his notes as if he could find an escape route. "Your Honor, this so-called affidavit is from a disgruntled ex-employee. There is no proof that these claims are legitimate." Jonathan didn't even flinch. "Then let's call them as a witness." Sterling's eyes snapped toward him. Jonathan smiled just slightly. "That's right. I have them outside the courtroom right now." A murmur spread through the crowd. Sterling stood abruptly. "Objection." Judge Henderson raised a brow. "On what grounds?" Sterling hesitated just for a second, before regaining his composure. "This witness was not disclosed before the trial. We have a right to prepare a response." Jonathan shrugged. "Your Honor, I only just tracked them down last night. But if Mr. Sterling has nothing to hide, why not let them speak?" Sterling clenched his jaw. The judge glanced between the two men, considering. Then he let out a long sigh. "Bring in the witness." The door creaked open, and a woman stepped in. Mid-40s, business casual attire, but with an air of nervousness about her. She adjusted her glasses and walked toward the stand. Jonathan turned toward the jury, watching as they leaned forward, already drawn in. The bailiff swore her in, and she took a shaky breath. "My name is Rebecca Howard. I used to work for the foreclosure division of Sterling and Company." Jonathan stepped forward, keeping his voice steady but firm. "Miss Howard, can you tell us about your responsibilities at Sterling and Company?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I was in charge of processing mortgage documentation. Part of my job was ensuring the paperwork was properly executed before foreclosures could proceed." Jonathan nodded. "And did you ever notice anything unusual?" She looked at Sterling for a brief second before exhaling. "Yes." A sharp murmur ran through the room. Jonathan folded his arms. "Please elaborate." Rebecca swallowed. "There were instances where foreclosure files were missing signatures or endorsements, but instead of fixing the errors through the correct channels, we were told to handle it internally." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" She shifted uncomfortably. meaning we were told to sign them ourselves. The entire courtroom exploded in whispers. Sterling shot up from his seat. Objection. Your Honor, this is completely baseless. Judge Henderson held up a hand, silencing him. His expression was now dead serious. Ms. Howard, the judge said, leaning forward slightly, are you saying employees at Sterling and Company forged signatures on legal mortgage documents? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Sterling's jaw tightened. Jonathan didn't give him a second to recover. Ms. Howard, did you ever see this happen in regard to the foreclosure of my client's home? She exhaled shakily. Yes. Jonathan stepped closer. And who authorized it? She hesitated. Jonathan's voice hardened. Ms. Howard, I need a name. Rebecca looked down, then back up, her eyes locking onto Sterling. Him. A collective gasp filled the room. Jonathan turned toward the jury. Let me make this clear. Bryce Sterling himself oversaw the falsification of foreclosure documents. Sterling exploded. This is a lie. Jonathan didn't even blink. Then why is your signature at the bottom of the modified mortgage agreement? Silence. Sterling's breathing was heavy. Jonathan pulled out another document, holding it up. Your Honor, I have a sworn statement from another former employee confirming that Mr. Sterling routinely ordered fraudulent notarizations. Judge Henderson took the paper, his expression unreadable. Jonathan turned back to Sterling. So tell me again, Mr. Sterling, was this just a clerical error? Sterling had nothing. Judge Henderson rubbed his temple, letting out a deep sigh. This case has taken a turn I did not anticipate. Jonathan stepped back, letting the silence settle. The judge adjusted his glasses, then turned to Sterling. I want every foreclosure case tied to your firm reviewed immediately, Henderson said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. Sterling's face drained of all color. Jonathan took his seat, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. He had done it. He had turned the case upside down. And this was just the beginning of the end for Bryce Sterling. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Henderson's gavel rested lightly against the bench, his fingers drumming against the polished wood as he flipped through the documents Jonathan had just presented. His face remained unreadable, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Bryce Sterling sat rigidly, his lips pressed into a thin line. His once smooth confidence had cracked into something desperate, something frantic. He glanced at his legal team, but they avoided his gaze. They knew. Everyone knew. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, watching the slow unraveling of a man who had spent his career bulldozing over people who couldn't fight back. Only this time he had picked the wrong fight. Judge Henderson exhaled sharply and looked up. His tone was measured but steely. Mr. Sterling, I will ask you one final time. Do you have an explanation for why your signature appears on falsified foreclosure documents? Sterling swallowed hard. Your Honor, Jonathan cut him off. Actually, let me help you out. He pulled out another document. This, Jonathan said, holding up a thick folder, is a deposition from another former employee of Sterling and Company. They detail in explicit terms how your firm routinely altered documents to expedite foreclosures, often against elderly homeowners who had no means to fight back. A sharp murmur ran through the gallery. Even the jury, who had remained relatively composed throughout the trial, began to shift in their seats. Sterling stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is outrageous. This so-called witness is clearly lying. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Henderson ordered, his voice firm. Sterling hesitated but slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his fingers digging into the armrests. Jonathan continued, his tone dangerously calm. Would you like me to call them in? They're more than willing to testify under oath. Sterling didn't answer. Judge Henderson let the silence stretch before speaking. Mr. Sterling, based on the evidence presented, I am ordering an immediate suspension of all pending foreclosures managed by your firm until a full review is conducted. Sterling's face blanched. The judge's eyes narrowed. And pending that review, the court will be considering potential criminal charges. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Sterling jerked forward, slamming his hands on the table. This is a witch hunt. Judge Henderson's expression remained impassive. This is justice. Jonathan folded his arms, watching as the full weight of Sterling's actions finally came crashing down. He had fought so hard to control the narrative, to manipulate the law in his favor. And now, he was drowning in his own lies. Henderson turned to Jonathan. Mr. Cole, do you have any additional evidence to submit before we proceed with the final ruling on your client's property? Jonathan exhaled, allowing himself a moment to enjoy the shifting power dynamic. Just one more thing, Your Honor. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This, Jonathan said, is a formal request for an independent audit of every foreclosure handled by Sterling and Company in the last 10 years. The room exploded. Sterling shot up. You can't do that. Judge Henderson barely spared him a glance. I just did. Sterling's hands shook. Your Honor, this is a violation of... The only violation here is the one you committed, Mr. Sterling, Henderson said coldly. And if these allegations hold, you won't just be disbarred. You'll be in prison. Sterling staggered back, his confidence shattered. Jonathan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for Sterling to hear. You spent your whole career destroying people's lives. How does it feel now that it's happening to you? Sterling didn't respond. He couldn't. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, reclaiming the room's attention. At this time, the court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure on Ms. Calloway's home is officially nullified, and full ownership is restored immediately. A wave of relief washed over Jonathan. He had done it. He had won. But before he could even let that reality settle in, Sterling snapped. This is not over, Sterling snarled, his voice laced with pure hatred. You think you've won? You think this will stop me? Jonathan's expression remained cool, unshaken. It's already stopped you. Sterling took a step forward, his movements tense, unhinged. The bailiff instinctively moved closer. Jonathan met his gaze head-on. You built your career on greed, fraud, and exploitation. And now, you're just another criminal waiting to be exposed. Sterling's nostrils flared. He looked like he wanted to swing, but he knew everyone was watching. Finally, he turned and stormed out, his face a mask of pure rage. Jonathan exhaled, turning back toward his client, Ms. Calloway. She was still in shock, her wrinkled hands pressed over her mouth as she processed what had just happened. Jonathan offered her a small smile. Miss Calloway, you're going home. Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped his hands. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for fighting for me. Jonathan squeezed her hands gently. It was never just about this house. It was about making sure people like him never do this again. She nodded, her voice shaking. And you did. Jonathan turned back toward the crowd, where reporters had already begun scribbling notes, their cameras flashing. This case had started as a simple property dispute, but now it had exploded into something much bigger. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was a reckoning. And Jonathan had just turned the entire system on its head. But he knew one thing for certain. This fight, it wasn't over yet. Jonathan stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the trial still clinging to his shoulders. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as flashes from the media's cameras flickered like lightning around him. Reporters crowded forward, their voices merging into a chaotic wave of questions. Mr. Cole, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you think Sterling will face criminal charges? What does this mean for other victims of fraudulent foreclosures? Jonathan adjusted his tie, exhaling slowly before addressing the swarm. "Justice was served today," he said, his voice firm but measured. "But this isn't just about one case. It's about a system that has failed too many people for far too long. We exposed fraud today, but there are countless others out there still suffering. This fight is far from over." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Jonathan was already moving forward. He wasn't here for press conferences. He had work to do. As he made his way through the sea of reporters, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against a sleek black SUV across the street. Detective Harris. The man had been sitting in the gallery for most of the trial, watching everything unfold with quiet intensity. Now his arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. Jonathan approached, tilting his head slightly. "Didn't take you for the courtroom type," Harris smirked. "Didn't take you for the type to shake an entire legal institution. But here we are." Jonathan chuckled, but the moment was short-lived. The detective's expression hardened. "You know Sterling isn't going to take this lying down," Harris said. "He's well connected. People like him don't just disappear quietly." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I figured as much. But it's not just Sterling anymore. His entire operation is being picked apart. The court ordered a full-scale audit on every foreclosure his firm has touched. If there are more fraudulent cases, this could turn into a class action lawsuit." Harris nodded. "It could, but that's what worries me." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Harris glanced around before lowering his voice. "Sterling is desperate, and desperate men make dangerous decisions." Jonathan crossed his arms. "If he tries anything, he'll only dig himself deeper." Harris sighed. "I hope you're right." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card. "But just in case, here's my direct line. Call me if anything feels off." Jonathan hesitated before taking the card. He had handled plenty of legal battles, but the way Harris spoke sent an unsettling chill through him. He wasn't just talking about legal retaliation, he was talking about something worse. Before Jonathan could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Joe Martinez, his attorney. He stepped away from Harris and answered. "Joe, tell me you've got good news." "Not exactly," Joe replied, his tone edged with concern. "Sterling's already making moves." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "What kind of moves?" "The kind that involve a very expensive crisis management team and some well-placed favors in the media," Joe explained. "He's spinning the narrative, making it look like you orchestrated a smear campaign against his firm. He's claiming the documents you presented were misinterpreted and that the court acted on bad information." Jonathan clenched his teeth. He had expected something, but this was fast. "And that's not all," Joe continued. "I have reason to believe he's trying to get the ruling overturned on a technicality." Jonathan exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "What technicality?" "The fact that we introduced last-minute evidence without full disclosure to opposing counsel," Joe said. "He's arguing that it was procedural misconduct." Jonathan ran a hand over his face. "That's a reach." "Maybe," Joe agreed, "but he's desperate. If he can drag this out, stall the audit, muddy the waters, he might buy himself enough time to cover his tracks." Jonathan's mind was already working ahead. If Sterling wanted to play dirty, fine. But Jonathan wasn't going to let him rewrite the truth. "All right," Jonathan said, his voice calm but dangerously sharp. "Then we make sure he doesn't have time for damage control." Joe hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Jonathan's eyes darkened. "I'm thinking we don't wait for the system to catch up to him. We take this fight straight to the people." There was a pause. Then Joe let out a small laugh. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic," Jonathan smirked. "Let's just say Sterling isn't the only one who can control a narrative." Joe sighed. All right, I'll start setting up interviews. The media's already hooked on this case. We might as well use that to our advantage. Jonathan nodded, his mind already racing ahead. Good. Let's keep the pressure on. As he hung up, he turned back to Harris. You were right, Sterling isn't backing down. Harris tilted his head. And what are you going to do about it? Jonathan exhaled, his gaze steadfast. I'm going to make sure he never gets the chance to pull this again. Harris studied him for a moment before nodding. Then you'd better be ready. Jonathan was ready. Because this wasn't just a case anymore. This was war. The courthouse steps were packed. Reporters, community leaders, and even a few protesters holding signs demanding accountability had gathered, their voices blending into an overwhelming hum of anticipation. Inside, the tension was even heavier. Jonathan sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His posture was calm, controlled, but his mind was running at full speed. Across from him, Bryce Sterling looked visibly strained for the first time since this trial began. His usually impeccable suit seemed tighter, his confident smirk absent. The judge entered the courtroom, his face stern. Judge Whitmore wasn't known for his leniency, but today his expression was unreadable. All rise, the bailiff called. Jonathan stood, smoothing out his jacket as he did. The judge wasted no time. Mr. Sterling, I understand you've filed an emergency motion to dismiss the prior ruling on the grounds of procedural misconduct. Sterling cleared his throat before speaking. Yes, Your Honor. It is our position that Mr. Cole improperly introduced last-minute evidence, which significantly influenced the outcome of this case. As such, we request that the ruling be overturned and a retrial be considered. Jonathan let out a small exhale, resisting the urge to shake his head. This was Sterling's last card, and it was a desperate one. He wasn't here to clear his name. He was buying time, hoping to keep the audits from exposing the deeper fraud his firm had been committing. The judge turned toward Jonathan. Mr. Cole, do you have a response? Jonathan adjusted his tie before stepping forward. His voice was steady but lethal. Your Honor, the evidence we introduced was not new information. It was public record. The only reason it hadn't been presented earlier was because the plaintiff deliberately concealed it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jonathan continued. Furthermore, the very premise of their argument is flawed. They claim procedural misconduct, yet they have not provided a single piece of evidence that the ruling was based on anything other than facts. He turned to Sterling, who was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. What this motion really is, Your Honor, is an attempt to stall. The court ruled in my client's favor because we proved that the foreclosure was fraudulent. Mr. Sterling's firm does not want this ruling upheld, not because it was unfair, but because it opens the door to dozens, if not hundreds, of other cases just like this one. The murmurs grew louder. Jonathan held up a stack of documents. Since the ruling, we have received 16 other claims from homeowners who have experienced similar foreclosure discrepancies, each one tied to Mr. Sterling's firm. Sterling shot up from his seat. Objection! This is not relevant to... The judge held up a hand, silencing him. Sit down. Mr. Sterling clenched his jaw but obeyed. Judge Whitmore sighed and looked back at Jonathan. Are you saying this case is just the beginning? Jonathan nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. The judge leaned back, rubbing his chin. The weight of the moment settled over the room. This wasn't just about one house anymore. This was about a systemic abuse of power. Finally, the judge straightened. Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice laced with finality, I am denying your motion. The previous ruling stands. Sterling's face dropped. Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. Furthermore, In light of the new evidence Mr. Cole has provided, I am recommending a federal investigation into all foreclosure cases handled by your firm in the last 5 years. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Jonathan stayed perfectly still, though inside he felt a rush of vindication. This was the moment he had fought for. Sterling, now visibly shaken, opened his mouth, but no words came out. The judge gave him a hard look. Court is adjourned. The gavel slammed, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan stepped into the cool afternoon air, greeted by the blinding flashes of cameras and the chaotic sound of reporters shouting his name. He barely had time to process the moment before Joe Martinez was beside him, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. "Damn, Cole," Joe muttered, shaking his head. "You didn't just win. You buried him." Jonathan exhaled, glancing back at the courthouse entrance. Sterling was still inside, likely trying to figure out how his empire had just crumbled in real time. "I didn't bury him," Jonathan said, his voice quiet. "He did it to himself." A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone raised. "Mr. Cole, what's next for you?" Jonathan met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "There are still families out there fighting the same fight," he said. "This case was a victory, but it's not the end." He turned to the cameras. "We exposed one firm today, but this problem runs deeper than just Sterling. This is about accountability, about people who think they can bend the law for their own gain." His voice hardened. "That ends now." The crowd erupted with questions, but Jonathan didn't wait around. He had already said what he needed to. As he stepped away from the courthouse, a familiar voice called his name. "Cole." Jonathan turned to see Detective Harris standing near a black SUV, arms crossed. "You're making powerful enemies," Harris said. Jonathan smirked. "Wouldn't be the first time." Harris exhaled. "Just watch your back. Exposing corruption has a way of making people desperate." Jonathan nodded. "Duly noted." As Harris climbed into his vehicle, Jonathan took a moment to soak in everything that had happened. The case was won. Sterling was finished. And for once, the system had worked in favor of the people. But he knew this fight wasn't over. It never really was. Jonathan took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked forward, ready for whatever came next. Final thoughts for the audience. Power belongs to those who refuse to back down. Jonathan didn't just fight for justice. He changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because trust me, this isn't the last time someone like Sterling will try to get away with corruption. And next time, you'll know exactly what to do.